5 mass shootings. 5 in 1 week. Southport, North Carolina, a guy opens fire from a boat at a waterfront bar. 3 dead, 5 wounded. Grand Blanc, Michigan, a man drives into a church, shoots up the sanctuary, and sets it on fire. 4 dead, 8 injured. Eagle Pass, Texas, gunfire during a casino event, 2 killed, 5 wounded. Another in Louisiana, and another in North Carolina. And those are just the headlines big enough to break the news. 5 mass shootings in America in a single week. And what does the administration do? Well, mostly nothing, mostly silence, except of course for on social media and Fox News, where rumors of the attackers' possible motives run wild. But here's what they are doing. They're drawing up plans to send federal troops to Portland, Oregon. Not because Portland asked for it. In fact, Oregon's governor literally said, "We don't need you, we don't want you." But the White House is still planning the move because apparently oat milk latte drinking Portland hipsters are a bigger threat to national security than bullets flying through churches. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice, supposedly the temple of blind justice, fairness, and the rule of law, decides its top priority is dusting off an old vendetta case against James Comey. They indict him for perjury from years ago, charges past attorneys general said had no merit. And then, as if to make the defense attorney's dream job easier, this all began with a Trump post on social media, demanding that it be done. And then, the icing on the cake. Trump and Pete Hegseth hold a meeting with generals where they mock the military, bash rules of engagement, complain about fat generals with beards, and turn the whole thing into a bad protein powder commercial about masculinity. Trump calls Americans the enemy within and suggests using the military against civilians. And in the middle of all this macho chest thumping, the administration is pulling billions in law enforcement and counterterrorism funding away from blue states like New York. Hundreds of billions. The money that helps the NYPD keep everybody safe, whether they are left, right, or center. So let's do the math. No real response to mass shootings. Plan troop deployments where they're certainly not needed or wanted. Indict old enemies. Undermine generals. Defund law enforcement in places where people you didn't vote for live. If these priorities sound strange to you, you're not the only one. They're more like contradictions on steroids. And they're dangerous. So, welcome to your neighbor on the left. Today's episode of Back Porch Files is called Strange Priorities. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another supplemental installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, a podcast about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host and neighbor, the one who waves politely, mows the lawn, and occasionally loses his cool yelling at the news. So yes, today's topic is strange priorities, because when you look at this administration's choices, you don't get a straight line. You don't even really get a zigzag. You get a funhouse mirror of contradictions. Silence on shootings, obsession with enemies, plans for troops where they're not needed, funding cuts to police in places that do need them, and all of it wrapped up in the same old macho law and order posturing. So let's walk through it, piece by piece. Let's start with the shootings, because multiple mass shootings in a week isn't a news cycle. It's another page of a long story of crisis. Southport, North Carolina. It's Friday night. People are out at the American Fish Company bar. It's a waterfront place. Live music, cold drinks, the kind of place you go to forget the world for a couple hours. And then shots ring out from a boat. By the time it's over, 3 people are dead, 5 people are wounded, and the entire community is traumatized. Alexandria, Louisiana. Multiple shots fired at a gathering, supposedly linked to a dispute. 5 people wounded. And the one, of course, that got the most press, Grand Blanc, Michigan. A man doesn't just open fire on a church. He literally drives into it, starts shooting, and sets the building on fire. 4 dead, 8 injured. It reads like the script of a horror film, except, of course, it's not fiction. And those are just some of them. There were others, smaller body counts, but still terror, still trauma, still lives damaged or stolen. 1 week, that was. And from the administration, no plan, no response, no DOJ initiative, no new policy proposals, not even the usual performative thoughts and prayers. Nothing. And here's the thing. Silence is a choice. When you ignore a crisis, you are prioritizing something else. You're saying, this is not urgent. This does not move my needle. And that should really disturb us. Because if 5 mass shootings in a week, regardless of who perpetrated them, doesn't get your attention, what does? Now compare that silence to what's happening with Portland. The White House is reportedly planning to send federal troops into the city. Not responding to a request, not offering help, planning to move them in against the wishes of Oregon's governor, who flat out said they're neither needed nor wanted. Why Portland? Why now? It's not about safety. It's not about public demand. It's about politics and optics. It's about staging the latest strongman show in an area that he feels doesn't praise him enough. Because the president knows what he wants on TV. Uniforms, armed vehicles, footage of taking control. That plays better with his base than boring things like policy or compromise. Now, I'd like to say this sets a dangerous precedent. A president planning troop deployments into a state that doesn't want them. That's not just strange priorities. That's authoritarian creep. That's the federal government telling states your autonomy is optional. But it's certainly not a precedent. He's done it in D.C. and L.A., both despite local opposition and both under false pretenses. But the mass shootings get no plans. Okay, so now let's talk about James Comey. The DOJ has indicted him for perjury, tied to testimony from several years ago. As I'm sure you know by now, if you're the type of person who listens to political podcasts, past attorneys general looked at the same evidence and said, no case, lack of evidence, move on. But this is Trump 2.0. Suddenly, it's the case of the century. Suddenly, the DOJ has the time, the resources, the urgency, and supposedly the evidence to prosecute James Comey. Now, why? Because Trump never forgave him. Not for refusing to pledge personal loyalty, not for investigating Russia, not for being his own man when Trump wanted a lapdog. This isn't justice. This is vendetta. And Trump's own social media post days before expressly telling Attorney General Bondi to deal with a specific list of enemies just hands Comey's defense lawyers Exhibit A, proof of political motivation. I've said this before. If the DOJ can be weaponized against old enemies, it can be weaponized against anyone. Priorities shift from protecting the public to protecting the president's ego and doing his bidding. We've changed the process of justice from finding a crime, identifying a suspect, compiling evidence, and then indicting the suspect, to finding a suspect, finding a crime, indicting the suspect. It's a major shift, and it's a very, very troubling one. And then there's the military meeting. Trump, joined by former Fox host and current Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, meets with generals. And instead of discussing strategy or readiness or real security, the meeting turns into a pep rally for toxic masculinity. Hegseth rails against rules of engagement as if protecting civilians is weakness. He mocks generals for their beards, their weight, their supposed lack of toughness. Trump, of course, eats it up, rambling on about masculinity, suggesting the military should be used for civilian law enforcement, and of course dropping the phrase, enemy within. Now think about that. The commander-in-chief calling Americans the enemy within, while talking about using the military against those civilians. He's talking about Democrats. He's talking about liberals. He's talking about people who protest his words and actions. That's not policy. That's authoritarian rhetoric. That's planting seeds of Civil War thinking. And in case it needs to be said, the measure of a general is not his waistline. It's his judgment. It's his strategic brilliance, his ability to protect lives. But that doesn't fit into the Trump-Hegseth macho fantasy. Not to mention, if military leaders need to be in shape, who's going to tell the commander-in-chief to lay off the quarter-pounders and hit the treadmill? And finally, the great irony. While all this law and order chest thumping is happening, the administration has been yanking billions of dollars in federal funding for law enforcement and counterterrorism from blue states. New York is hit especially hard. Money that helps the NYPD investigate terrorism, prevent attacks, keep streets safe, gone. For now, a judge has put a temporary block on the cuts, but the threat remains. Can you imagine if 5 or 10 years ago, someone would have told you that a Republican administration would be defunding the police? You would have sent that person for a psychological evaluation. But here we are, through the looking glass. So which is it? Are we for law and order, or are we for law and order only if the state voted for you? Because if law enforcement is something you only fund when it's politically convenient, then it's not law and order, it's extortion. It's political punishment dressed up as fiscal policy. So put all these pieces side by side. 5 shootings, silence. Troops planned for Portland. A Comey indictment fueled by vendetta. A military meeting about masculinity instead of security. Billions pulled from blue state police. So yeah, I kind of lied in the title because that's not a government with strange priorities. That's a government with barely hidden priorities. Revenge, optics, and control. And that's the road we're on. Not towards safety, not towards justice, certainly not towards stability, towards something much darker. So here's the takeaway. Strange priorities aren't just strange, they're deliberate. Every silence, every indictment, every troop plan, every funding cut, it's a choice. And together those choices paint a picture of an administration that values revenge over justice, spectacle over safety, and control over democracy. Our job is to call it what it is, to refuse to normalize it, to not just shrug and say, Oh, well, that's just politics. Because this isn't just politics. It's a roadmap to authoritarianism. And the longer we accept it, the harder it's going to be to stop. Let me just leave you with this. There's a story of a dog that had its chain reduced one link at a time every few days until his chain was so short he could barely move. He never resisted because the loss of his freedom was so slow, so incremental, that the dog didn't notice. Over time, the chain was reduced one link at a time every few days until the dog had no slack at all. How short will your chain be before you notice? Thanks for listening to another episode of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. Thrilled that you took the time to download and listen to this, and I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear comments. I'd love to hear complaints. I'd love to hear counter arguments. I'd love to hear whatever it is that you want to share. You can do that by reaching out to the podcast on any of the social media platforms. The links for those are all on the Linktree page, and the address of the Linktree page is in the episode description. We'll be back on Tuesday with another full episode. So until then, stay vigilant and engaged. Stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.